The door to room 7 swung open so hard it cracked against the inner wall, and Maude Bristol spun around with her heart lurching into her throat, her back pressing flat against the washstand as the candlelight threw wild shadows across the face of the man standing in the doorway. Matthew Sullivan, the drifter, the man she had decided, in the span of exactly 4 days, that she absolutely could not trust. He stood there breathing hard, dust still rising off his coat, his hat gone, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that made him look less dangerous and more desperate. And that distinction mattered enormously to Maude because she had been cataloging the differences between those two things ever since she had arrived in Redhawk, New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1878, on a stagecoach that smelled of wet leather and misfortune. "You need to get away from that window," he said. His voice was low, urgent, stripped of the careful politeness he had been using for days. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Maude said, and her own voice surprised her with how steady it came out, because inside she was shaking and not entirely from fear. "Maude," he said her name like it cost him something. "I am not asking you to go anywhere with me. I am asking you to step away from the window because there is a man across the street with a rifle and he has been watching this room for the past 20 minutes. She stared at him. He stared back. And in the terrible silence that followed, a single thought carved itself through the fog of her suspicion and her anger and her carefully constructed armor. Nobody had warned her. Nobody had warned her that this drifter, this man with the dark past written into every careful movement he made, had gone downstairs 3 times before she had even settled in for the night, 3 separate times, to ask old Hector Dunn, the innkeeper of the Redhawk Territorial Hotel, which room was the safest room in the building for a woman traveling alone. She had not known that. She only found out now because Hector had pulled her aside not 30 minutes ago, wringing his hands in his apron, and told her in a hushed, guilty rush, as though confessing a sin, that the stranger in room 12 had come to him 3 times asking that exact question, and that Hector had told him on the 3rd asking that room 7 was the one that faced the interior courtyard, the one with 2 exits and a bolt that actually worked. 3 times. 3 times before she had even known there was anything to be afraid of. And now here Matthew Sullivan was in her doorway, not with the calculated ease of a predator, but with the raw, exposed urgency of a man who was genuinely, desperately afraid something terrible was about to happen to her. She moved away from the window. She hated herself a little for how quickly she did it. He exhaled like something inside him had been wound tight enough to snap and had just barely been released. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Do not thank me," Maude said, folding her arms across her chest, pressing her back against the far wall. "Tell me what is happening, all of it, right now." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, something that had been locked away for a very long time. And she thought, in a distant, bewildered corner of her mind, that whatever Matthew Sullivan had been hiding since he arrived in Redhawk, she was about to find out. She had left Philadelphia 4 months ago with $22, a carpet bag, and a letter from her deceased father's attorney, informing her that the only inheritance remaining to her was a piece of land in New Mexico territory that nobody had apparently wanted, which in itself should have been a warning. She had taken the train as far west as the railroad went in 1878, which was not nearly far enough. And then she had taken a series of increasingly uncomfortable stagecoaches across a landscape that seemed determined to convince her she had made a catastrophic mistake. She was 26 years old. She was educated, practical, and stubborn in a way that her mother had called unbecoming, and her father had called backbone. She had managed her father's accounts for 3 years before his death, kept the household together for 2 more years after it, and had developed, out of pure necessity, a talent for reading people quickly and accurately. She had read Matthew Sullivan incorrectly. That rankled. The first time she had seen him was at the stagecoach depot in Santa Fe, 3 days before she arrived in Redhawk. He had been leaning against the wall of the depot office with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that being noticed was something to avoid, his hat pulled low, his long dark coat dusty from the road, and she had catalogued him as dangerous on instinct alone. His eyes were the color of old timber, brown going to amber at the edges, and they had moved to her the moment she stepped off the previous stage and had not moved away for several seconds longer than was comfortable. She had shifted her carpetbag to the opposite hand, lifted her chin and looked directly back at him. He had looked away first. She had filed that away as unknown threat, possibly manageable, do not engage. He had taken the same stagecoach to Redhawk. He had sat across from her for 6 hours and had said exactly 4 words, which were "ma'am" when she boarded, "pardon" when the stage lurched and their knees knocked together, "no" when the driver asked if anyone wanted to stop at the trading post halfway through, and nothing else. He had not attempted conversation. He had not attempted anything. He had watched the landscape out the window with the fixed attention of a man reading a language written across the dust, and she had watched him watch it, and had revised her assessment incrementally. Dangerous, yes, but not to her specifically. The danger he carried was the kind that had been done to him, not the kind he was planning for others. She had seen enough of both kinds to tell the difference. She had been a little worried that she might be wrong. As it turned out, she had been right about the shape of his danger, but entirely wrong about the direction it pointed. She had arrived in Redhawk on a Wednesday, checked into the Territorial Hotel, and gone to see the land agent about her inheritance. The land agent, a small, oily man named Percy Galt who wore a cravat that was slightly too fashionable for a town this far from anywhere, had looked at her deed, looked at her, and said with very thin patience that he would be happy to purchase that parcel from her at what he called a fair market price, and which she immediately recognized as an insulting one. She had said no. Percy Galt had said he was sure she would reconsider, after she had time to think about how difficult it was for a woman to manage property in this territory. She had said that she was going to manage it just fine and had walked out. By the time she got back to the hotel, she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched, though she could not have specified by whom. Redhawk was a small but busy town, sitting at the junction of 2 cattle roads and a freight route, populated by a working population of ranchers, merchants, drifters, and the usual collection of people who ended up in frontier towns for reasons they preferred not to explain. The main street was unpaved, but the boardwalks were solid. The saloon was called the Silver Spur. There were 2 churches, a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, a doctor, and a jail that looked like it had seen significant use. She had met Hector Dunn, the innkeeper, who was 63 years old and walked with a pronounced limp from a wagon accident 20 years prior, and who had the innate quality of a man who had seen enough of the world that very little surprised him, but most things still interested him. He had given her room 7 without being asked, had told her the bolt worked, had mentioned without being specifically asked that the Redhawk marshal, a man named Trout, was a decent sort and could be found at the jail on Front Street if needed. She had wondered mildly why he was volunteering this information. She had not wondered hard enough. She had not wondered at all about the man in room 12. Now Matthew Sullivan was standing in her room with the door closed behind him, and he was looking at her with an expression she was struggling to categorize, because it did not fit neatly into any of her systems. "The man outside with the rifle," she said, keeping her voice even. "Who sent him?" Matthew moved to the wall beside the window, keeping his back flat against it, and angled his head enough to see a narrow slice of the street below without being visible from outside. Whatever he saw there made a muscle work in his jaw. "Percy Galt," he said. She absorbed this with the practiced stillness of a woman who had trained herself not to show reaction in moments of shock, because showing reaction invited exploitation. "The land agent," she said. "The land agent who is also, as of about 8 months ago, the silent partner in a mining operation that has been prospecting the ridge land north of Redhawk." Your land, as it happens, sits directly on the survey line of what they believe to be a significant silver deposit. She thought about Percy Galt and his too fashionable cravat and his thin patience and the way he had spoken to her, as though the outcome of their conversation was already decided. "How do you know this?" she asked. Matthew turned away from the wall and looked at her directly, and the thing she had been watching shift behind his eyes settled into something that looked like resolve. "Because," he said, "8 months ago I was the one who did the surveying." The silence in the room was very complete. "You work for Percy Galt," she said. "I worked for Percy Galt. I quit when I understood what he intended to do with the survey results and the landowners who were inconveniently sitting on top of them. You are not the first person he has tried to force out, Maude. You are just the first one he has not managed to intimidate yet, probably because you arrived only a week ago and do not know enough to be intimidated properly. Or possibly because I am not the intimidating kind," she said. Something moved at the edge of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "That has occurred to me," he said. She studied him. He had a scar along his left jawline, a thin white line that was several years old at least, and his hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who did outdoor physical work, roughened and calloused, but his speech was careful and precise in a way that suggested education somewhere back in his history. "Why are you here?" she asked. "In Redhawk. Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he did not look away from her. "I came back to warn the landowners." There were 4 of them. 2 sold after Galt's men visited. 1 left town. "You arrived after I got here, and I did not know who you were until you went to see Galt, and then I knew." "You have been watching me," she said. "I have been watching over you," he said. "There is a difference." "That distinction," she said carefully, "requires a great deal of trust in your own intentions, and I have no particular reason to trust your intentions." "No," he agreed. "You do not. That is a fair assessment." She stared at him. He stared back. The candle on the washstand flickered. "The man with the rifle," she said. "Is he going to shoot through the window?" "He might. More likely he is waiting to see if you will be moved somewhere more accessible. Galt prefers pressure to direct violence when he can manage it. The rifle is a threat, not necessarily an action." "Prefer not to test that theory," she said. "Agreed." She made a decision. It was not a comfortable decision, and she knew as she was making it that she was operating on a combination of evidence and instinct that would horrify anyone who had the luxury of being cautious. But she had not had that luxury for years, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I am going to trust you provisionally," she said, "against my better judgment and with significant reservations. If you betray that trust, I will make sure you regret it in ways that are both creative and lasting." He looked at her for a long moment, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was unmistakably a smile, brief and real and surprising. "Understood," he said. Matthew Sullivan had been born in 1848 in a small Ohio town to a schoolteacher mother and a surveyor father, which explained both his education and his eventual profession. He had come west in 1869 at the age of 21, with a surveying kit, a good horse, and the kind of optimism that the frontier reliably educated out of people within the first year. He had spent the following decade working for various railway and mining concerns across the territories, which had made him useful, made him widely traveled, and made him acquainted with a variety of men whose moral architecture he had initially given too much benefit of the doubt. Percy Galt had been the most recent in a sequence of employers about whom Matthew had eventually been forced to revise his charitable assessments. But Percy Galt was also the first one about whom he had felt a specific, pressing guilt, because Percy Galt's operation had begun to target not just empty or contested land but parcels belonging to people who had come to the frontier in good faith and built something real. He had quit 8 months ago, in January of 1878, on a morning in Santa Fe, when he had overheard a conversation between Galt and one of his men about what would need to happen to a ranch family north of Redhawk if they refused a third offer. He had walked out of the office, saddled his horse, ridden north, and warned the ranch family, who had packed up and left within a week, which he had not intended but could not entirely regret. He had then spent the following 8 months in a state of purposeful but uncomfortable motion, trying to locate the other landholders on Galt's list and determine what could be done, while managing the knowledge that Galt was aware of his defection and would not be forgiving about it. He had not been to Redhawk in 4 months. He had come back because the name Maude Bristol appeared on the deed for the last remaining parcel on Galt's survey line, and he had been unable to find her to warn her. And then she had walked off a stagecoach in Santa Fe and solved that problem for him, and he had recognized her name from the paperwork, and had spent the 6-hour stage ride to Redhawk trying to figure out how to explain a situation that he had no clean way into. He had watched her arrive at the hotel. He had watched her go to see Galt. He had watched her come back with her chin up and her carpetbag in her hand, and the particular set to her jaw that he was coming to recognize as Maude Bristol in a condition of controlled fury, and he had gone downstairs to Hector Dunn and asked, the first time, which room she was in. Hector had looked at him with an expression of measured suspicion and said it was not his place to give out information about guests. He had tried again that evening, framing it differently, explaining that he was concerned for the woman's safety in terms general enough that Hector could not refute them, while specific enough that Hector, who was a perceptive man, understood that the concern was genuine. Hector had told him, on the third asking, that room 7 was the room he would put someone in if he wanted them safe, and had given him a look that communicated, with considerable efficiency, that Hector expected this information to be used correctly. Matthew had intended to knock on her door and explain everything that evening. But then Galt's man had appeared in the street below, and explaining had given way to more immediate urgency. He told Maude most of this, standing in her room with the window at his back, choosing his words carefully and not softening the parts that did not flatter him, because she was clearly a woman who would detect softening and penalize it heavily. She listened without interrupting. She sat on the edge of the bed, her carpetbag beside her, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that he had already learned was not composure but concentration. She was not a tall woman, not a particularly striking one in the conventional sense, but she had sharp gray eyes and a quality of absolute present attention that he found disquieting in the best possible way, as though whatever she was looking at came into clearer focus simply by being looked at. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "The silver deposit," she said. "Have you seen the geological report?" He blinked. "Yes." "Is it genuine?" "In my professional assessment, yes. The survey data I gathered indicates a significant vein running through approximately 400 acres of the ridge, which means the subsurface mineral rights on your parcel are potentially worth considerably more than Percy Galt offered you." She nodded slowly, as though fitting pieces together. "What is the legal mechanism he uses?" she asked. "If intimidation does not work, what does he do?" He hesitated, because this was the part that required context, and the context was not clean. "He has a relationship with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. 2 of the clerks there are on his payroll. He has had deeds amended, survey records altered. In 2 cases, ownership was transferred through paperwork that the original owners later swore they never signed." Maude's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind her gray eyes went very cold and very focused. "Forgery," she said. "Among other things, yes." "Then the question," she said, "is whether there is a federal mechanism that operates independently of the Territorial Land Office." He looked at her. "There is, actually, the General Land Office in Washington. If a claim of fraudulent transfer is made directly to the federal commissioner, the Territorial Office cannot intervene in the investigation without implicating itself. And is there a federal commissioner in the territory? There is a regional inspector who passes through Albuquerque on a quarterly circuit. He was last here in August. He will be back in November." She looked at the window, then back at him. "It is October now." "The end of October, yes." She stood up from the edge of the bed with the decisive quality of a woman who has completed one internal conversation and begun the next. "Then I need to keep my deed intact and myself alive until November," she said. "After which I will file a federal complaint, name Percy Gault and his associates, and present your survey data as evidence of motive." "You will also need an independent witness to the survey," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I will testify," he said. "I intended to regardless. I have copies of the original survey data that Gault does not know I kept. I kept them for exactly this reason." She held his gaze for a longer moment than was strictly necessary. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You have nothing to gain and a significant amount to lose. Gault knows you left. If you come forward as a federal witness, he will make things considerably more difficult for you." He met her gaze and did not look away. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "I helped him build this scheme, even though I did not know the full scope of what I was helping with. That makes me partly responsible for the harm it caused. I would like to make that right." The silence between them was different this time, less hostile, more careful, like two people who have been standing on opposite sides of a door and have both simultaneously reached for the handle. "All right," Maude said. "Then we have work to do. But first, what do we do about the man in the street?" The man in the street was, as Matthew had predicted, more deterrent than executioner. His name was Walt Griggs, and he worked for Percy Gault in a general-purpose enforcement capacity that meant he was mostly used to fright and occasionally to damage property, and very rarely to cause more serious harm. He was not a subtle man, and he was not expecting the drifter and the Eastern woman to go straight to Marshal Trout's office at 10 o'clock at night. Marshal Trout was not what Maude had expected, which she reflected was becoming something of a theme in Redhawk. He was a broad, calm man in his 40s with gray at his temples and reading spectacles, still pushed up on his forehead from whatever he had been doing before they knocked, and he listened to Matthew's account and Maude's clear, organized summary of events with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for this particular conversation for some time. "I know Percy Gault is not operating clean," the marshal said when they had finished. "I have known it for a while. I do not have enough to move against him yet within the territorial system, because two of the men he has influence over are also connected to the territorial government, and I cannot move without that looking like overreach on my part." "But a federal complaint changes that," Matthew said. "A federal complaint changes everything," the marshal agreed. He looked at Maude with steady appraisal. "Miss Bristol, are you prepared for this to become uncomfortable before it becomes resolved?" "Marshal Trout," Maude said, "I have been uncomfortable my entire adult life due to circumstances that required more backbone than accommodation. I am quite prepared." He nodded slowly, with what looked remarkably like respect. "Walt Griggs in the street below your hotel is enough for me to bring him in tonight. That gives Gault a message without tipping our full hand. Meantime, I would suggest Mr. Sullivan take the room adjacent to yours for the duration, and I would suggest you do not go anywhere in this town without being in eyeshot of someone who is specifically not on Percy Gault's payroll." Matthew nodded. Maude nodded. They walked back to the hotel under a sky crowded with stars so thick they looked like spilled salt, and the temperature had dropped sharply, as it did in New Mexico territory in late October, the desert's cold moving down from the mountains with complete indifference to the concerns of people on the ground below. The hotel was quiet. Hector Dunn was still up, sitting behind his counter with a lamp and a well-worn Bible, and when they came in he looked at both of them over the top of his reading spectacles with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unsurprised and profoundly relieved. "Griggs is gone from the street," Hector said. "Marshal Trout will have him," Matthew said. Hector nodded and reached under the counter for a key. "Room 11, he said to Matthew. "It is next to room 7. The wall between them is not as solid as I would like." "That is actually useful," Matthew said. "I thought it might be," Hector said and returned to his Bible. Maude stood in the corridor between rooms 7 and 11 and looked at Matthew Sullivan in the lamplight and thought about 3 questions to an innkeeper, asked not once but 3 times about which room was safest. "Good night, Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Good night, Miss Bristol," he said, and then very quietly, almost to himself, "I am glad you are all right." She went into her room and closed the door and stood with her back against it in the dark for a long moment before she lit the candle and began to think. Sleep, when it came, was brief and not particularly restful, but she was accustomed to that. In the morning, Redhawk looked like a completely different kind of problem in the clear October light. The main street was alive with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town. The freight wagons and the women in calico going to the dry goods store, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee and horse from the livery at the end of the block. It was beautiful, in the stripped and functional way of a place that had been built by people doing serious work, and Maude stood on the hotel porch with her second cup of coffee from the kitchen, which Hector had provided with a generosity that seemed to be his default mode, and looked at it and thought about what it would mean to stay. She had not thought about staying. She had thought about the land as an inheritance to be converted or managed at a distance, a legal and financial problem to be solved, not a place to which she might become attached. But standing here in the thin golden light with the Sandia Mountains going pink on the eastern horizon and the smell of high desert sage coming down on the cold air, she found herself revising that. Matthew came out and stood beside her. He had a cup of coffee too. He stood a polite and socially legible distance away from her, which she noted and filed away. "The land agent's office opens at 8, he said. "I would rather you did not go there today." "I was not planning to," she said. "I was thinking about something else entirely." He glanced at her. "What?" "What the land looks like," she said. "The parcel. I have only seen the deed. I have not seen the actual land." He was quiet for a moment. "It is beautiful land," he said. "The ridge it sits on overlooks a valley that runs north to south for about 12 miles. There is a spring on the property, a reliable one. The survey I did last year, I spent 3 days on that ridge. I kept thinking someone should build something there." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "Could you take me there?" she asked. "When it is safe." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression was very careful, like a man handling something fragile and valuable with hands that are perhaps more callous than the task requires. "Yes," he said, "I could do that." The days that followed were a balance of vigilance and waiting that Maude found useful in the way that difficult things often were. She was not a passive person by any inclination, and waiting had never been comfortable for her, but waiting with purpose and with a clear objective ahead was a different kind of animal, and she was able to manage it. She spent her mornings at the hotel, working through the paperwork she had brought with her from Philadelphia, including her father's land documents, the attorney's correspondence, and a detailed account she had been constructing of the timeline of the property transfer and what she knew about the mineral survey. She was building a case file, methodical and thorough, which was the only way she knew how to approach anything important. Matthew came and went with the quiet, purposeful movement she was coming to associate with him specifically. He made 2 trips to the marshal's office. He visited the land records at the courthouse, which was a single large room attached to the sheriff's office, and began pulling documents related to the other land transfers Galt had been involved in, constructing a paper record of the pattern. He had a way of doing this work that was organized and patient and entirely without self-promotion, which she found increasingly interesting the longer she observed it. They ate dinner together at the hotel each evening. Hector provided meals from a kitchen that was simple but competent, and the 4 days they spent in this careful, industrious proximity produced between them the particular kind of intimacy that comes not from grand gestures but from shared work, shared worry, and the accumulation of small observations that add up, quietly and without announcement, to something very like understanding. On the 3rd evening, over fried venison and sweet potatoes, she asked him about the scar on his jaw. He touched it briefly without self-consciousness. "A wire fence dispute in Texas," he said. "Not as interesting as it sounds." She waited. "I was 23, he said, doing survey work for a ranch operation. There was a neighboring rancher who believed the survey was wrong and wanted to demonstrate that. He was not gentle about demonstrating it. And was he right? Was the survey wrong?" He looked at her. "No. Did he ever accept that?" "No," she smiled briefly. "That seems about right for Texas." He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him fully laugh, unrehearsed and unguarded, and she discovered that it changed his entire face in a way that was, she admitted only to herself, significantly affecting. They were both quiet for a moment after the laugh had faded, and the silence had a quality that neither of them addressed directly but that both of them, she suspected, felt. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said. She told him. She told him about the accounting work, about her mother who had died when she was 16, and the years of managing the household with no particular help, about her father who had been a good man in theory but a distracted one in practice, consumed by the business failures that had followed each other in patient succession, until his death 2 years ago had left her with the $22, the carpetbag, and the deed to land she had never seen. She told him this matter-of-factly without self-pity, because that was the only way she knew how to tell it, but she was aware as she was telling it that he was listening with the kind of attention that did not interrupt and did not flinch, and that when she finished there was a quality to his silence that was not pity but something warmer and more sustaining than that. "What did you want to do?" he asked. "Before all of this, before the accounting, before managing everything, what did you actually want?" Nobody had asked her that in a very long time. She thought about it honestly. "I wanted to build something," she said, "something that was mine. I was very good at maintaining other people's things, and I was always aware that that was not the same as building." He nodded slowly. "I think that is why I did not sell immediately," she said. "When the attorney told me about the land, some part of me heard it as an opportunity that was not dependent on anyone else's judgment of what I should or should not do with it." "That is a very good reason," he said quietly. She met his eyes across the table and held them for a moment longer than the strictly conversational required. The problem with Percy Galt was that he was not a man who accepted setbacks as information. He was a man who accepted setbacks as challenges requiring escalation, which Marshall Trout had privately communicated to them as a concern, and which Matthew confirmed from personal experience. Walt Griggs in the town jail was an inconvenience, but Percy Galt had other men, and the week that followed Walt Griggs's arrest demonstrated this with uncomfortable clarity. There was a fire at the back of the hotel on a Tuesday night, small and quickly contained by Hector and 2 guests with well-aimed buckets, but obviously deliberate based on where it started and how. There was a visit to the marshal's office by 2 men who claimed to be from the territorial attorney's office and who asked questions about Matthew Sullivan that the marshal answered with careful brevity and immediately reported to Matthew afterward. And there was the morning that Maude went to the courthouse to examine the land records and found that 2 of the documents she had specifically asked the clerk to hold for her review had been removed from the folder. She stood at the records desk and looked at the gap where the documents had been with a cold, clear fury that she kept very carefully contained. The clerk, a young man named Danny who had the look of someone who was genuinely sorry but also genuinely frightened, told her that someone from the land office had come and requested the documents on what he thought was proper authority. Maude thanked him, which he clearly did not expect, and walked with steady steps out of the courthouse and directly to Matthew, who was on the boardwalk outside, and said, quietly and precisely, "Galt moved faster than we expected." Matthew's jaw tightened. "How many documents?" "2. The transfer records from the Henderson parcel and the Morales survey notation, both of which were evidence of the pattern." "I have copies," he said. "I made copies of everything before I brought them in." She stared at him. "You expected this." "I know how Galt operates," he said. She looked at him for a moment with something she recognized, to her own slight discomfort, as profound relief, and underneath the relief something warmer and more inconveniently located. "Matthew," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noted it. "You are significantly more prepared for this situation than you have been allowing me to believe. I did not want to alarm you prematurely. In the future," she said, with great clarity, "please alarm me. I function considerably better with complete information." He looked at her with that almost smile, the one that lived in the corner of his mouth and had been appearing with increasing regularity. "Noted," he said. "The copies were held not in the hotel but at Marshal Trout's office, which turned out to be the right call, because the hotel room was searched that afternoon while both Maude and Matthew were at the jail reviewing documents." Hector reported the search with the resigned expression of a man who was done being surprised by Percy Galt's behavior and had reached the stage of being primarily annoyed by it. Maude stood in her room after, looking at her carefully ordered papers, which had been disturbed but not taken, since whoever had searched had presumably been looking for the specific survey documents Matthew possessed, and thought about what it meant that Galt was now willing to commit this many crimes in sequence to remove a problem that was, at its core, a single woman with a legal deed. It meant the silver was real. It meant the deposit was significant. And it meant that Percy Galt was exactly the kind of man who had calculated, perhaps correctly based on prior experience, that a woman alone in a frontier territory was manageable without the ordinary legal niceties, and that she was now, as a consequence, considerably more dangerous to his plans than he had anticipated. She found she was not frightened. She was something that was the opposite of frightened, a kind of clean, forward-leaning clarity that she associated with her best moments of decision. She was going to win this. It was then that Hector Dunn, the innkeeper, knocked softly at her open door and said, with an expression of diffident apology, that there was someone downstairs who wanted to speak with her, and that he could send them away if she preferred, but that in his judgment the visitor seemed sincere. The visitor was a woman named Esperanza Morales. She was in her late 30s, dark-haired and steady-eyed, and she sat in Hector's small parlor with her hands folded and her back straight in a way that Maude recognized as the posture of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is doing it before they lose their nerve. The Morales parcel had been one of the ones Galt had acquired. Esperanza's family had held it for 14 years. The transfer had happened 6 months ago, and Esperanza believed the signature on the transfer document was not her husband's, who had been seriously ill at the time and had died 3 weeks after the document was dated. She had not been able to prove it. She had not been able to find anyone to listen. She had heard about the Eastern woman at the Territorial Hotel who had refused to sell to Galt, and she had come. Maude sat across from Esperanza Morales and listened to every word of it, and when she was done, Maude said, "Will you testify before the federal land inspector?" Esperanza looked at her directly. "Yes," she said. Maude extended her hand. Esperanza shook it. That evening when she told Matthew, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "That is the second independent witness. That is enough for a federal investigation independent of what I provide." "It is also the right thing," Maude said, "regardless of what it means for us." He looked at her when she said us, and she looked back at him, and neither of them commented on it, but it hung in the air between them with considerable presence. The following Sunday, Maude and Matthew rode out to the ridge land. Marshal Trout had suggested it would be safe for a few hours, as Galt's primary attention at the moment was occupied by a development in Santa Fe, where 2 of his land office contacts had apparently become nervous enough about the federal timeline to begin distancing themselves, which was the first crack in the dam, and which meant Galt's surveillance of Redhawk had thinned temporarily. The ride to the ridge was 2 hours, through a landscape that moved through scrub desert into pinon and juniper, and then, as they climbed, into ponderosa pine with the smell of warm resin and cold air coming down from above. Matthew rode a sturdy gray horse he had acquired in Redhawk. Maude rode a bay mare provided by the livery on Marshal Trout's quiet recommendation, a sensible, calm animal that suited her exactly. They talked on the ride in the unhurried way that had become natural between them over the preceding 10 days, covering practical matters, and then drifting into less practical ones with the ease of people who have established, without formal announcement, that this is a space where the less practical is welcome. He told her about the decade of survey work across the territories, the things he had seen and mapped, and the places that had impressed themselves on his memory and stayed. She told him about the books she had managed to keep through various moves and financial contractions, a small collection that she had edited ruthlessly, until only the ones she genuinely loved remained, and the fact that she had learned French from a grammar in the 3 months between losing her secretary position in Philadelphia and deciding to come west, because learning a language felt like the most useful thing she could do with 3 months of enforced waiting. "Did it help?" he asked. "Not in the slightest," she said. "There is not a great deal of French spoken in New Mexico territory." He laughed again, and she looked at the side of his face when he was not looking at her and thought, with the kind of absolute honest clarity that ambushed her periodically, that she was in a significant amount of trouble. The ridge was exactly as he had described it, and considerably more than he had described it. It rose from the valley floor in a long, gradual sweep of red and ochre sandstone and broken limestone, covered in places with the dark green of Pinon. And from the top, the valley below opened out like a gift, 12 miles of grassland going gold in the autumn light with the thread of a creek through the middle of it, and the mountains on all sides holding everything in a bowl of extraordinary silence. She stood at the top and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Matthew stood a few feet behind her, not crowding the moment. "This is mine," she said finally, not possessively, wonderingly. "This is yours," he confirmed. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she recognized now because she had been cataloging it for 10 days, the expression of a man who is trying very hard to be careful with something that he is increasingly aware he does not want to be only careful with. "What do you want?" she asked him. "You asked me that over dinner. I am asking you." He was quiet for a moment. "Something that stays," he said. "I have been moving for 10 years and I have been very good at it, but I am not certain it is what I want to keep being." She held his gaze. "I think this land needs a proper survey," she said. "Not for Galt, a proper one for building purposes. Someone who knows the water table and the soil composition, and where the spring runs in a dry year." "I know those things," he said. "I suspected you might," she said. They looked at each other on the top of that ridge in the October light with the valley spread below them and the mountains around them like a closed fist protecting everything inside it, and the conversation that had been accumulating between them for 10 days reached the point where it could not continue without acknowledging itself. "Maude," he said. "Matthew," she said at the same time. And then, because she had never been the type to wait for someone else to be the first one, she said, "I think I would like very much to know you better than I currently do." He looked at her with something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was the combination of both that occurs when something you have been holding carefully and uncertainly suddenly becomes, by the grace of someone else's courage, also held by them. "I would like that," he said, "very much." He did not reach for her, because he was a careful man and she was a woman who valued being chosen rather than taken, and she appreciated both of those things. But he walked forward to stand beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and they stood together on the ridge and looked at the valley below, and the thing that had been building between them settled into something that felt like the beginning of permanence. November arrived in Redhawk with a cold front that covered the Sandias in snow and turned the main street to frozen mud, and with it came the federal land inspector, a spare, unsmiling man from Massachusetts named Calvin Hobart, who wore a federal seal pin on his lapel, and had the air of a man who had been lied to by territorial officials so many times that he had stopped giving them the courtesy of initial benefit of the doubt. Maude met with Inspector Hobart for 2 hours on the morning of the 3rd of November, in the marshal's office, with Matthew beside her and Marshal Trout at his desk, and Esperanza Morales seated across the room with her own documentation. She presented the case with the organizational clarity she had spent 3 weeks building, walking through the timeline, the survey data, the pattern of pressure and fraudulent transfer, the gap in the courthouse records, the incident of the rifle outside the hotel, the fire at the hotel's back wall, and the search of her room. Matthew presented his survey records and his testimony about what he had heard in the Santa Fe office in January. Esperanza presented the transfer document and a letter from a Santa Fe physician who had attended her husband in his final illness, and stated that in his professional judgment, the man had not been capable of signing legal documents in the week the transfer was dated. Inspector Hobart listened to all of it without visible reaction. He made notes. He asked careful, precise questions. He requested to see the original deed documents and the copies Matthew had made, and examined both with the focused attention of a man who does not miss things. At the end, he closed his notebook and looked at each of them in turn. "I will be opening a federal investigation," he said. "The Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe will be served with a preservation order for all documents related to the parcels identified. Percy Galt and 2 employees of the Territorial Land Office will receive formal notices of investigation within the week." He paused. "Miss Bristol, your claim to the property in question is federally noted as contested under investigation. Until the investigation concludes, no transfer of that property can be legally recorded. I will be recommending appointment of a federal overseer for the Territorial Land Office for the duration. I will also be recommending that the Marshal's office in Redhawk be formally acknowledged as a cooperating body in this investigation, which will provide some insulation from territorial political interference." He looked at Maude. "You are right to come directly to the federal level," he said. "In my experience, matters of this kind do not resolve well when they remain within a compromised system." "I had good advice," Maude said. Matthew did not say anything, but she felt him shift slightly beside her in a way that she recognized as the movement of a man receiving something he is not certain he deserves. She turned to look at him briefly, and he turned to look at her, and neither of them said anything, but everything that needed to be communicated about that moment was communicated. Percy Galt left Redhawk within 3 days of the federal notices being served, which was not a surprise and was, in its way, more information than a confrontation would have been. He moved to California, which was far enough away to be safe from the immediate territorial jurisdiction, and which, as Marshal Trout observed dryly, was California's problem now. The 2 land office clerks were suspended pending investigation, and then dismissed when the investigation confirmed what the paper trail had already suggested. The Henderson and Morales parcels presented more complicated legal situations, since those transfers had been recorded, and the original owners had, in the case of the Hendersons, moved on and been difficult to locate. The federal investigation would take time. Maude understood that, and time in legal matters was not something that moved at the pace of fiction, but her parcel was protected. The deed was secure. The federal notation meant that no court in the territory could record a transfer without triggering federal review. She had built something, the first thing she had built entirely for herself, entirely from the beginning. On the evening after Inspector Hobart left Redhawk on the northbound stage, Maude sat on the hotel porch in her coat with the last of the day's warmth going out of the boards beneath her feet, and Matthew came and sat beside her, closer than he had sat on previous evenings. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "Build a house," she said. He was quiet. "A real one," she said. "On the ridge. Near the spring, something that will last. You will need a survey," he said. "I will need someone who knows the water table and the soil composition and where the spring runs in a dry year," she said. I believe I mentioned this." He turned to look at her. The lamplight from Hector's window was just enough to see by, and she looked back at him in it without the careful management she had been maintaining, letting him see what was there without editing it. "I could stay," he said. It was a question in the shape of a statement. "I was hoping you might," she said. He reached out very slowly and took her hand, his calloused thumb moving across her knuckles in a way that was tentative and tender and entirely deliberate. And she turned her hand in his so their fingers interlaced, and they sat there in the cooling November evening with the stars coming out thick overhead and the town going quiet around them, and nothing else was said because nothing else needed to be. The winter of 1878 and the spring of 1879 were the hardest and the best months of Maude Bristol's life, which was saying something given the competition. They were hard because building in New Mexico territory in winter was difficult work, the ground freezing solid at night and thawing muddy by midday, and the wind coming off the mountains with a personal quality of hostility, and because the legal process of securing the land against all future challenges required patience and correspondence and a particular kind of sustained alertness that was exhausting to maintain. They were the best because Matthew Sullivan was there. He began the survey of the ridge land in late November, working methodically through the cold days with the careful precision she had come to think of as his signature quality. And he came back to the hotel in the evenings with detailed notes and sketches that he spread across the table in Hector's parlor, which Hector had offered as a workspace with the pleased generosity of a man who has spent 63 years providing shelter, and is delighted to find that the people sheltering under his roof are doing something worth sheltering. She and Matthew worked through the survey notes together, and she learned from him rapidly, because she was constitutionally incapable of being in the vicinity of knowledge without absorbing it, and he taught with the direct, unpatronizing patience of someone who respects the intelligence of the person he is teaching. Their evenings settled into a pattern that was domestic in the way of two people who have, without formal announcement, decided that the domestic is where they want to be. They ate together. They worked together. They talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who have discovered the rare pleasure of an interlocutor who is genuinely worth talking to. In December, he kissed her for the first time, standing in the cold outside Hector's parlor door with snow coming down in large soft flakes from a sky that had gone white. And she had been expecting it, and had been not expecting the degree to which it unmade her careful composure entirely. And she had put both hands on the front of his coat and kissed him back with everything she had, which he received with the full attention he gave to everything, and which left them both slightly breathless and looking at each other in the snow with the identical expression of people who have just confirmed something very important. "Maude," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it." He looked at her with those amber-edged brown eyes, the ones she had been cataloging for 2 months, the ones she now knew could carry humor and worry and exhaustion and desire in varying combinations, and what they carried now was something so simple and direct that it required no decoding at all. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time, and I am not going to continue not saying it." She looked at him in the falling snow. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been resisting it because I have an extensive list of very logical reasons why this is complicated, and I have now decided that the list can wait." He laughed, surprised and delighted, and then he kissed her again, and the snow came down around them with the complete indifference of nature to human drama, and it was perfect. Esperanza Morales's case against the fraudulent transfer of her family's land was taken up formally by the federal investigation in February of 1879, and in April, the investigators' report confirmed that the transfer document bore a forged signature, which was the first formal legal finding against Galt's operation. The Morales parcel, the land that had been Esperanza's family's home for 14 years, was returned to her legal possession. Maude was at the land office when Esperanza received that news, and she watched Esperanza hold the restored deed in both hands and press her lips together, against an emotion that she did not want to display in a public office. And Maude thought about all the women she had known who had been maneuvered out of their rightful places by men who had calculated correctly that the system would support the maneuver. And she felt a clean, fierce satisfaction that here, in at least this instance, the calculation had been wrong. She and Esperanza had become friends over the winter, the kind of friendship that forms between women who have looked at each other clearly and found the view encouraging, and which was the other best thing to come out of the whole difficult situation, in Maude's accounting. The house on the ridge was begun in March, when the ground had thawed enough to break properly. Matthew drew the plans himself, sitting at the table in Hector's parlor with a precision instrument set and paper, building a house designed for the specific land it would sit on, for the spring and the views and the wind patterns he had catalogued all winter. He designed it to last, built from the local stone and timber, with windows that faced the valley and a porch that faced west for the sunsets, and a kitchen that was larger than strictly necessary because Maude had told him she intended to use it. He hired 2 local men who were looking for work and knew adobe and stone construction, and he worked alongside them through the spring days, while Maude managed the paperwork for the homestead claim and continued her correspondence with the Federal Land Office and began, cautiously and with great interest, to think about what the land could produce beyond silver. There was the spring. There was good grass in the valley. There was soil at the lower elevations that could be worked. She had read about agriculture in arid climates, which was not a topic she had known anything about in Philadelphia, and found it engaging in the specific way of a problem with real stakes and variable solutions. She rode out to the ridge most afternoons, and often she and Matthew would work in companionable parallel, he on the construction and she on the planning, and the house rose from the red stone of the ridge with the patient, satisfying progression of something genuinely well built. And every time she rode up and saw it farther along than the day before, she felt the same deep, sustaining satisfaction she associated with things she had made herself. They were riding back from the ridge on an April evening, the sky going orange and rose behind the western mountains, when Matthew pulled his gray horse to a stop on the road and said, "Maude." She pulled up beside him and looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket. He was not a theatrical man, she had learned, and nothing about the gesture was theatrical. He was simply a man reaching for something he had been carrying carefully. He held out a ring. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise set in it, the turquoise the exact color of the New Mexico sky, and she recognized that he had chosen it specifically and thoughtfully, and that the choice communicated more about the nature of his feeling than any more conventional setting would have. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me." I am aware that is a significant statement from a man who was until recently a drifter with a complicated recent past and limited fixed assets. She looked at the ring. "You have a survey kit and a skill set and the respect of every decent person in Redhawk," she said, "and you have been building me a house for 6 weeks. "That is true," he said. "Matthew," she said, "I came to New Mexico territory to build something that was mine. I did not expect any part of what I actually found here, but I have found it and I would like to keep it, including you." She looked up from the ring to his face. "Yes." He reached over and took her left hand very carefully and put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it against the red evening light and thought that she had never in her life owned anything more precisely right. They were married in Redhawk on the 14th of May, 1879, in the smaller of the 2 churches, by a minister named Reverend Caldwell, who was a thin, dry man of great dignity and genuine warmth. Hector Dunn was there, beaming with the satisfaction of a man who considers himself causally responsible for a good outcome and is entirely correct to do so. Esperanza Morales stood beside Maude as witness, which was the only proper choice. Marshal Trout attended, still carrying himself with the comfortable gravity of a man whose job is full but manageable, and shook Matthew's hand afterward with a sincerity that communicated everything that needed communicating. The house on the ridge was finished in June. Moving into it was the most private ceremony Maude had ever participated in. Just the two of them, riding up in the early morning with the last of their things from the hotel and Hector's send-off of a large food basket that was thoroughly impractical to carry on horseback, and which they managed anyway. The house was stone and timber and cool inside even in the heat of the day, and the porch faced west exactly as designed, and the kitchen was large and the windows full of the valley below. She stood in the kitchen and unpacked the food basket, and listened to Matthew moving through the other rooms with the particular sound of a person moving through a space that is theirs, settling into it the way water settles into the shape of what it fills. She thought about Philadelphia, about the small accountant's office and the carpetbag and the $22, and she thought about the stagecoach depot in Santa Fe and a man with dark eyes who had looked at her and then looked away, and she thought about Hector Dunn's face when she came back from the marshal's office, and the note in his voice when he said the stranger had asked him 3 times. 3 times. As though once were not enough. As though he needed to be certain. Matthew came into the kitchen doorway and leaned against it, watching her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Hector," she said, "the 3 questions." He was quiet for a moment then. "I was afraid I had gotten there after you were already in danger. I needed to be sure you were in the safest possible room." "You did not know me yet," she said. "No," he said, "but I knew you were alone and the land agent had you on his list, and that meant you were in danger. That was enough." She set down the jar she was holding and crossed the kitchen to him and took his face in both her hands, something she did rarely but with great intention, and she looked at him carefully. "Nobody warned me," she said. "I did not know you had done that. Hector told me on the night you came to my door, and I have been thinking about it ever since. 3 times, Matthew." He looked at her steadily with those amber-edged eyes. "You were more important than I was comfortable admitting at that point," he said. She kissed him, brief and certain, and then stepped back into the kitchen with the warm efficiency of a woman who has a lot to do and is entirely satisfied with the shape of her life. "Come and help me unpack this basket," she said. He came and helped her unpack the basket. The summer of 1879 was abundant in the particular way of things that have been properly prepared for. The spring on the ridge ran clean and consistent through July and August, confirming Matthew's survey assessment, and the lower pasture where Maude had planted a trial garden produced yields that surprised her with their generosity, the soil behaving better than she had expected under the combination of irrigation, and the rich mineral content she was discovering was characteristic of the ridge land. She had been right about the land. It was good land. Not just for what it might contain in silver deposits that were now the subject of a federal review process she was watching carefully from a measured distance, but for its own sake, for what it could grow and shelter and provide over time. Matthew took a contract with the Federal Land Inspection Office in August, a formal surveying engagement that would take him across the territory on a 6-month circuit, producing independent survey data to verify the accuracy of records that were being audited as part of the broader investigation. It was good work, important work, and it used his skills in the service of something he genuinely believed in, which was a combination he had not had for long enough that it felt new. He would be away for weeks at a time. Maude was not a woman who needed constant proximity to feel secure in a relationship, and Matthew was not a man who felt that absence was a threat to what was between them, and they had discussed this with the practical clarity that characterized their communication about everything important. He wrote letters when he was away, long ones, detailed with the landscapes he was crossing and the things he observed, and the thoughts that came to him in the evenings on the trail. And she wrote back letters equally long that were full of the ridge and the garden, and the things she was building, and the conversations she had with Esperanza, and the occasional unexpected development that she addressed and resolved and reported with the dry satisfaction of someone who is not in the habit of leaving things unresolved. Esperanza had returned to her land by September, bringing her grown daughter and her daughter's husband, who knew cattle, and had begun rebuilding what Galt's operation had interrupted. The two families, the Sullivans on the ridge and the Moraleses in the valley below, had developed the particular neighborly relationship of people who have been through something real together, and on the other side of it have found genuine affinity, which meant practical cooperation in the ordinary frontier sense, and also the more specifically valuable thing of being people who chose to be in each other's lives. In October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Maude had stepped off a stagecoach in Redhawk with her carpet bag and her $22 and her deed to land she had never seen, she sat on the west-facing porch of the house on the ridge and watched the sun go down behind the mountains and thought about the year with the complete and honest accounting she gave to everything. She had arrived with a hidden motive of her own, if she was truthful, the not quite conscious drive to prove that she could do this alone, that the life she had been managing for other people for a decade could be converted, by her own hand, into something of her own construction. That the act of refusing Percy Galt had been not just practical but personal, a line drawn in territory that she was only just beginning to understand, was hers to define. She had found, instead, that the most important things she had built here she had not built alone. Matthew rode up the ridge road in the last of the evening light, returning from 2 weeks in the southern part of the territory, and she heard his horse before she saw him and stood up from the porch chair with a movement she was not going to analyze too closely in terms of what it revealed about her feelings. He came through the gate and dismounted and tied the gray to the post and came up the porch steps, rode dusty and tired and entirely himself, and she walked into his arms as though that were the most natural motion in the world because it was. He held her and said nothing for a moment. "The Southern Survey is done," he said into her hair. "The federal report goes to Washington in December." "Good," she said. "The Henderson family has been located," he said. "Nebraska. They are being notified about the federal finding." She pulled back enough to look at him. "That means all 4 parcels on Galt's list are resolved," she said. "Or in the process of being resolved, yes." He looked at her steadily. "It is done, Maude. What we came here to do, it is done." She looked at him in the evening light, this man she had mistrusted and catalogued and revised and come to know and love, this drifter who had asked an innkeeper 3 times where to put her so she would be safe before he had any right to care, and she thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you had not known you were going and find that it was, unambiguously and completely, the right place. "Come inside," she said. "I made dinner." "You made dinner," he repeated, with the specific intonation of a man who has been eating trail food for 2 weeks, and this news has therefore landed with significant impact. "I did," she said. "Hector gave me his venison stew recipe. I think I have understood it correctly." He followed her inside, and the house was warm and smelled of the stew and the pine that she had burned in the stove and the indefinable quality of a home that is genuinely inhabited and genuinely loved. They sat together at the table in the kitchen with the lamp burning between them and ate the stew, which was very good, and talked about the survey and the garden and Esperanza's cattle situation, and a book Maude had ordered from a bookseller in Albuquerque that had arrived while he was gone, and the evening settled around them with the deep, particular contentment of 2 people who have chosen each other deliberately and continue, each day, to make that choice. Later, she told him. She had been waiting until she was certain. She was certain now. "Matthew," she said. He looked up from his cup. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He put the cup down very carefully. He looked at her across the lamplight with an expression she could not entirely catalogue because she had not seen it before, the specific combination of disbelief and gratitude, and something so large and quiet it did not have a ready name, and she watched him arrive at whatever destination that expression was leading him to. He got up from his side of the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair, which was not a thing he did often, crouching. It was not a movement that fit his particular physical dignity, and the fact that he did it now communicated everything. He took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am happy, Matthew." He pressed his lips to her hand, and she felt him exhale, very slowly, against her fingers. "So am I," he said. The baby was born in May of 1880, a boy, which Matthew received with the kind of profound, uncomplicated delight that some fathers take a little time to arrive at, and he arrived at immediately. They named him James Henry Sullivan, James for Matthew's father and Henry for Maude's, and he arrived in the house on the ridge in the presence of Esperanza, who had a practical knowledge of these matters, and a doctor from Redhawk who had been summoned via a relay of riders and arrived, somewhat breathless, in time to be useful. Maude sat in the bed in the room with the east-facing windows, the one that caught the first light in the morning, and held James Henry, and Matthew sat beside her with one hand on her shoulder and the other touching the baby's closed fist with one finger, and the whole world was reduced to this specific room and this specific light and these specific people. "He has your nose," Matthew said. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "I can already tell." Matthew looked at her. "You have met my nose for 30 seconds, she said. "You have been watching me be stubborn for a year and a half." He laughed, soft and low, and kissed the side of her head. "Fair point," he said. The federal investigation into Percy Galt's operation concluded formally in August of 1880, with a federal circuit court finding in Santa Fe that declared the fraudulent transfers null and void, imposed significant financial penalties on the surviving operation, and formally referred several individuals for criminal proceedings in the territorial court. Percy Galt in California was the subject of a separate federal warrant that the California authorities were notified about, which was as far as the territorial jurisdiction could reach, but it was enough. He was finished in New Mexico territory, and he knew it. Maude read the formal finding in the Albuquerque newspaper, which had covered the investigation with increasing interest once it became a federal matter, and set the paper down on the kitchen table with the quiet satisfaction of a matter thoroughly and permanently concluded. Matthew was outside with James Henry, who at 3 months old had developed a fixed fascination with horses that Matthew was accommodating by holding him near the gray, while the horse breathed patiently at this new small person. She watched them from the kitchen window, the man and the baby, and thought about dark pasts and hidden motives and all the forces that had assembled in the autumn of 1878 to bring two people who had no particular reason to be in the same place to the same stagecoach depot in Santa Fe, and what came of it. She thought about 3 questions to an innkeeper, about the hidden kindness of that, about caring for someone's safety before you have any right to call it care. She went outside, down the porch steps and across the yard, and stood beside Matthew, and he adjusted his hold on James Henry so the baby was between them, and all 3 of them looked at the horse, who had the philosophical air of an animal that has seen many things and is not unduly troubled by any of them. "He is going to want to learn to ride before he can walk," Matthew said. "Absolutely not," Maude said. "He is a frontier boy. He is 3 months old." Matthew looked at her with the corner of the mouth smile she had catalogued so many times. It had stopped being something she noticed and become simply something that was his. That was part of what he looked like to her. "Give it a year," he said. She gave it a year and was wrong by 6 months, because James Henry Sullivan, it turned out, had opinions about horses from very early on, and the gray was patient enough to accommodate them under close supervision. And Matthew turned out to be exactly the kind of father she could not have predicted but should have extrapolated from the kind of man he was, careful and attentive, and genuinely delighted by the existence of this small person. In 1882, their daughter Clara was born, with Maude's gray eyes and Matthew's dark hair, and a quality of focused determination at the age of 6 weeks that made Esperanza, who was present again, laugh and say She was going to make her parents very interested people. In 1884, a second son, named Thomas, came into the world with considerably less drama than either of his siblings had managed, arriving early in a morning in March with the efficiency of a person who has somewhere to be, and who immediately demonstrated that somewhere to be was the center of whatever activity was currently happening in the Sullivan household. The house on the ridge had been expanded twice by then, a necessity that Matthew had designed into the original plans as a possibility, so the expansion happened cleanly and without disrupting the character of the building. The ridge land was producing well, between the grazing in the lower valley and the kitchen garden that had grown substantially from the trial plot, and was now large enough to supply not just the family but a regular contribution to the Morales household below and a seasonal market in Redhawk. The silver deposit on the ridge land was the subject of ongoing federal mineral rights review, a slow and formal process that Maude tracked through correspondence with the Federal Land Office, and which she expected would result, eventually, in either a settlement or a formal licensing arrangement for extraction rights that would benefit the land owner rather than a set of corrupt land agents. She was patient about this in the way she was patient about everything that was moving in the right direction, slowly but correctly. Matthew's federal survey contract had expanded over the years into a more formal arrangement with the Territorial Surveying Commission, which was in the process of being reorganized under federal oversight as part of the ongoing cleanup of territorial administration. He was, by 1884, one of the most trusted independent surveyors in the territory, which was a career that had found its proper shape in a way that suited him exactly, work that was important and rigorous, and took him into the landscape he had been reading for 15 years. But that brought him home to the ridge, to the house and the children and Maude, in a regular rhythm that was the opposite of the decade of drifting. He was not a drifter anymore. He was a man who stayed. On a September evening in 1884, Maude sat on the west porch with the baby Thomas asleep in the cradle Esperanza's son-in-law had made, and Clara at her feet engaged in a detailed and entirely fictional conversation with a collection of rocks she had arranged in a circle, and James Henry somewhere on the lower slope of the ridge with Matthew, visible as two small figures moving through the long grass in the last of the afternoon light. The mountains were going purple and gold. The valley below was still and golden. The spring ran quiet at the edge of the yard, audible when the wind dropped, which it did now, giving her a moment of the kind of silence that is not empty but full of everything that is there. She thought about the woman who had arrived at the Redhawk Territorial Hotel with a carpetbag and $22, and a deed to land she had never seen, and a list of reasons why this was the only option available to her, and she thought about what that woman had not known was coming. She had not known about the land itself, the way it would settle into her like something she had been missing without knowing it. She had not known about Esperanza, or about Hector, or about Marshall Trout, or about the particular community that a frontier town could be when it was inhabited by decent people doing serious work. She had not known about Matthew Sullivan. She had not known about 3 questions to an innkeeper. She had not known that a man could care that specifically about the safety of someone he had not yet spoken to, and that this kind of care was not possession or control but something cleaner and more fundamental, the simple, radical act of wanting a person to be safe because they are a person and that matters. She had not known that she could build something this complete from the materials available to her, which had seemed, in Philadelphia, entirely insufficient. She had built it anyway. That was the part she was most proud of. Matthew came up the slope with James Henry on his shoulders, the 4-year-old's hands gripping the dark hair with cheerful disregard for comfort, and they came through the gate and across the yard, and Matthew ducked carefully to deliver James Henry to the porch boards and then straightened up and looked at her. "How long has Thomas been asleep?" he asked. "An hour," she said. He sat down in the chair beside her, and Clara immediately climbed into his lap with the comfortable entitlement of a child who has never doubted her welcome. And he held her with one arm and reached across with his other hand to Maude's, which was resting on the arm of her chair. And she turned her hand and they held on, as they had been holding on for 6 years, as she expected they would hold on for whatever years came after. In this house on this ridge in this life that she had built from $22 and stubbornness, and one unexpected drifter, who had asked an innkeeper 3 times which room was safest. She looked at the valley going gold below, and the mountains going dark above, and the sky between them turning into the extraordinary New Mexico night, and she thought, this is what I was going toward all along, even when I did not know it, even when I was afraid. This. The stars came out, one by one, and then all at once, as they always did in New Mexico territory, as though the sky had been waiting for the right moment, and had finally decided that the moment was now. Thomas stirred in his cradle and settled back to sleep. Clara fell asleep in Matthew's lap. James Henry, who never slept at reasonable hours, was still wide awake and asking questions about stars that neither of them could answer fully, and they tried anyway, taking turns, their voices low and even in the cooling evening air, and the answers blended together into a kind of music that was only audible from inside this specific life. It was exactly enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was everything.